welcome to this first conversation in a series from Bias to Bonus, exploring the problem of women founders' access to capital. Last year, the Harvard Business Review came up with a bombshell report that, according to Crunchbase, that the percentage of funding going to women founders was, guess how much? Somebody.
20?
20? Anyone else? Other guesses?
10.
2.3. Down from 2.8 in 2019. So what is happening here, and what can we do about it? That's what we are here to discuss. And I am so lucky to have this group of three marvelous women, all faculty here at Santa Clara University. We have Maya Ackerman, who's assistant professor in computer science and engineering in the engineering department. We have Laura Ellington, who is the Patrick A. Donahoe Professor of Communication. And we have Vanita Banducci, who's a lecturer in gender and engineering. So we have representation from both engineering and arts and sciences here with us today. Thank you so much, ladies, for being here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start asking a few questions to the panelists and ask each one, when I ask the first question, to introduce a little bit more about themselves first and then get into the answer to the question. So the first question goes to you, Maya. I know you've done a lot of research on this topic and also have personal experience on this issue as an entrepreneur yourself. So I would love to hear from you, what exactly are we seeing? Can you paint the picture of what's happening out there?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so great to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, so you pretty much covered my intro pretty well. I'm a professor here in the computer science and engineering department, and I'm founder CEO of Wave AI, which is a musical AI startup. So I had a lot of personal experience out here in Silicon Valley raising money and doing a business before I sort of stumbled into doing research in this area. A group of students wanted to look into how to help investors make informed decisions. And just out of curiosity, I wanted to look into if there's any sort of bias in the data. And it became obvious very, very quickly that the data is just oozing with bias. And what we did, which I think is really important, even though it's fairly elementary, the first thing we did, we broke down the data into 4 groups. So companies that only have male founders, companies with only female founders, and then mixed gender teams that have a female CEO or a male CEO. And then many of you may have heard of this idea of the pipeline problem, right? This idea that not enough women are trying to run businesses. And so very often when you sort of bring up gender bias, people say, well, women are not asking for money. What do you want us to do? Which is sort of a really interesting chicken and egg problem. Are women not asking for money because they don't want to build businesses, or is it that when women ask for money, they can't get it, and so you sort of maintain the small population of women? So instead of looking at totals, instead of saying, so men get 98% of the money and women get 2%, we looked at what happens when companies come to raise money. How much money do they end up raising, right? So if we have a company, let's say mixed gender, that has a female CEO or a male CEO, how much is each expected to raise? So since Bridget started by asking people, from these 4 groups, right, we have all male, all female, mixed gender, female-led, mixed gender, male-led. Who do you think would raise the most? Just shout it out.
Male.
Gender male.
Yeah, so one more time?
Male.
All male.
All male. So most people think all male. It's not true. I was really surprised. Mixed gender, male-led raise more money almost everywhere in the world. Except Silicon Valley, one of the only places, by only a little bit, but it's a small gap. So actually having a woman in the background helps, which is interesting. I don't think it's something that people know. For the most part, having a female founder, if she is not front and center, those are the companies who raise the most, almost everywhere in the world, and even in Silicon Valley, it's really close to all male. Okay? Now, if you have this mixed gender team, so you still get all this benefit of gender diversity, and there's a lot of research showing how gender diversity and racial diversity are really, really good for coming up with good decisions and actually sort of bringing good results. But if that same team has a female CEO, they raise significantly less money. Suddenly, it's way less than all male, way less than male-led mixed gender. So it's not as important what the composition of the founding team is as much as the gender of the CEO, which makes sense because investors primarily deal with the CEO, right? So in that sense, it's fairly easy to explain. So women get penalized when they lead. The bias is against female CEOs, not against female founders, which is a really, really important distinction when we go about trying to find solutions. A lot of venture firms that try to help focus on mixed gender teams, focus on companies that include women. Those companies don't necessarily have problems if they have a male CEO. And so as a result, a lot of these venture capital firms that try to help actually help companies that don't need the help, that are already ahead as far as their funding possibilities if they have a male CEO. Okay, so we need initiatives that help female CEOs. That's the main thing. One final thing, I know I'm taking a while here. Final comment that I think is so important. Okay, so you could say, all right, interesting, female CEOs don't raise as much. Maybe there is a good reason for it. Maybe for whatever reason, they're not as good at leading companies. So first of all, there is research showing, that's not my research, other people's research that shows that female and male CEOs do just as well as each other. Okay, so we can put that concern aside. But we also looked at sort of normalizing by other factors. We said, if we look at gender, number of exits, and education, if we look at these three considerations, which one is more important? And we came up with a machine learning-based way of gauging this. And it turned out that when it comes to the CEO, it's more important that the CEO is male than having prior exits and then being educated at a top university. Okay, so gender is more important than education and more important than prior exits. And so we have a really big problem, and I'm really excited to discuss some solutions with my colleagues here.
No, that's great. So what you're saying is that sort of all of the things being equal, gender is the deciding factor. That's a predictor.
No, it's actually significantly worse.
Yeah, I know, exactly.
It's not all things being equal. They will pick a less educated man with less business experience over a woman, on average.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, you're right. Even worse. All right. So Laura, I'd love to hear from you some insights about why we might be seeing this trend in the market.
Sure, thanks. I've been a professor at Santa Clara for 21 years. I'm a full professor of communication, and my areas look at communication in healthcare organizations and then also in gender studies. And a lot of my teaching focuses on that and is also cross-listed with the Women's and Gender Studies department. And the thing is, as a communication scholar, we don't usually ask why. Why is implicit bias? What we ask is how. How does this keep playing out over and over and over again? It seems like it's 2022. We shouldn't be doing this anymore. So from a communication lens, we think about the schemas, the expectations that we have for how people communicate. We have a very well-established idea in our heads, even though we don't tend to be aware of it, of what leaders communicate like. Leaders are decisive. Leaders have a powerful vision or other way of sharing big ideas and abstract ideas. Leaders are very confident. Not coincidentally, those set of traits and ways of speaking maps perfectly onto traditionally masculine communication styles, right? Traditionally, men have held those leadership positions. They still do in the vast majority of them. But it maps very onto communication styles that men tend to find comfortable and very much focused on what they've been socialized since birth to do. So focusing on problems rather than people, right? Being more focused on being instrumental, getting things done, and being very comfortable asserting status or even fighting for status. So Men, therefore, are often recognized as naturally exhibiting leadership communication. Well, it's not like women don't understand that and can't do that. So women often have tried to emulate masculine communication styles. The problem is that when they do that, instead of being seen as confident, they're judged as arrogant. Instead of being seen as decisive, they're judged as not collaborative. Right? Instead of being really focused on getting things done, they're somehow missing the abstract or the big idea. They're not bringing any brilliant genius stuff with them. So then women have the option of going, okay, well, I can use a much more feminine communication style. What's more expected from women? Traditionally, of course, it's historic, but historically and still, women tend to have more feminine communication traits, which include things like being more people-focused rather than problem-focused, exhibiting connection and trying to connect with people rather than exerting status over them, and being self-effacing, because we are told since birth that it's not nice to toot your own horn, right? Nice girls don't do these kinds of things. And so when women do that, they get judged as incompetent. Right? They can't be a leader because they're being too feminine. And unfortunately, this intersects badly with ageism. So young women who are feminine sounding end up being judged as either a sex object and dismissed for that, or judged as not mature enough. Yet mature women get judged as not having missed the window. If they had been brilliant, they would have done something earlier in their lives. They would have made a splash before then. We would have known. And then, of course, all of these traits are intersecting with implicit bias around race and around heteronormativity, anybody who's not gender conforming, right, or who isn't cisgendered, people who are non-binary or trans are dealing with even more of these kinds of expectations that are being violated. So what ends up happening to women is they're trying to balance a razor's edge between doing masculine stuff, right, completing the masculine objectives while sounding and looking feminine at the same time. Many women do this beautifully. It's really, really hard, and they do it. Even when they do it beautifully, they get rejected, and it's often over things like, I can't put my finger on it, but I just don't like her. I just don't trust her. I just don't believe she has what it takes to do it. Much like the Hillary Clinton problem, where we hired a much less qualified president, right? Because Hillary Clinton was not viewed as nearly as likable by so much of the electorate who was in the middle and had to make choices about these things. If you sound like a very powerful woman, you're going to have a problem in terms of how you are perceived. So, luckily, we have somebody who can talk about some solutions.
That is great. I mean, so much of what you said really resonates with me and my personal experience in my professional life. It really is this razor's edge. And I think one of the things that we discuss with the entrepreneurs that we work with is that the answer is not necessarily, act like a man, right, so that you can fit into the system, but rather, what do we need to do to change the system? And I would really love to hear from you, Bonita, in terms of your ideas around the bonus part of the bias. We've heard a lot about the bias and where that comes from and why. Let's hear more about the bonus and how we might be able to think through solutions as we go forward.
Great. Well, again, I'm Bonita Banducci, and I've been teaching gender and engineering now for 20 years in the engineering school. Based on my original experience as an entrepreneur, I had a store and restaurant on Union Square in San Francisco, which became the heart of the Union Square community, and the first restaurant reviewed in Vogue magazine many, many years ago. And it was there that I became passionate about seeking out how to articulate what it is that women bring to business that has been invisible and unarticulated, that would make a difference for being able to recognize the value that women bring to business. And it was my opportunity to do original research as a part of a consulting team working with Sun Microsystems in the early 90s, as a matter of fact, when Scott McNeely was head of Sun, when it was one of the biggest companies in the Valley. And it was actually Scott McNeely that I witnessed speaking about how when he had a group of people presenting ideas in his company, and he wasn't sure about the technology, he would go with the person that was most confident. And I want to underline that because confidence seems to be so important. I mean, it is so important. And then to juxtapose that with how often what I'm going to call more relational people, most of whom are women, but some are men, Often more relational people have a very high context way of looking at the world and a very questioning, always open to what else could be possible way, and also wanting to hear from the customer and hear from others way of approaching whatever they're dealing with. Joe Bowler, who's a math education professor at Stanford, has coined the phrase that women have a higher standard for understanding. And I really like that, and it explains, we also hear that even students will be asking questions about things that has many people say, oh, if they're asking questions, they don't understand. Whereas, for instance, I had one TA student who did a study with his research lab and realized, he said, he came back to class and said, they're asking very sophisticated questions. I didn't realize it. So, that's a whole other direction we can go down in terms of having women be discouraged from engineering because they're asking questions. In any case, this whole area of these relational competencies and wanting to understand more could even be considered to be some of the reasons why women often don't apply for jobs unless they have at least 95% of the job experience that's in the job requirements, whereas men often apply with just 60% of the experience. So this high context way of seeing things is one way that I think is we can interpret these competencies. And again, seeing these competencies is my strategy for wanting more women in the workplace, in the organizations, and at the tops of them. And it's also an explanation for why they're getting such great results. My favorite story is interviewing Carol Bartz at that time, all the way in the early 90s, when she was second in command at Sun Microsystems. And I asked her what she brought to the executive team that wouldn't be there if she wasn't there. And she said, well, I don't consider it to be my gender, and this is very typical. Most women think it's just common sense what they're thinking. And they've even told me that. But Carol Bartz said, what I bring is an ability to see all the ramifications of a given issue. For the most part, the men will take the highest priority problem, the highest priority solution, put the solution against the problem, and fight any fires that happen. She said, I like to prevent fires. And see, for me, that's a new competency. We know firefighters are considered to be great leaders, but how often have we pointed out the fire preventers, as being great leaders? And but then it was just like 10 seconds later that Carol Bartz said, for this, I'm considered to be not a team player. Now, why would she be considered to be not a team player? She's stalling the action. She's coming up with a much more complex solution. And, we got to get in there and just fight as soon as possible. She's getting to other people's turfs. She was head of worldwide field operations. What is she doing getting into finance and R&D and HR, other people's turfs? And then, of course, she's just not following the call of the quarterback. She's not doing things the way it's usually done. So that's one of my favorite distinctions, and there are a number of different things that fall out from being the fire preventer. But another very important distinction I want to share with you, which I think is very important also in terms of innovation, is the practice of playing devil's advocate in most organizations. I know that now there's a turning point and things are beginning to change, and we're doing the practices of improvisation and other things to try to be more innovative. But it was really in my class and in workshops I was giving where we identified that as much as devil's advocate is often used by the more individualistic people, the more relational people wanted to play angel's advocate. They wanted to build ideas. And how can we insert and frame this competency as a means of actually having people share ideas? And it was workshop I did with NASA, where one of the executives had said that he was disappointed that there were no new ideas bubbling up in his organization. When I did this exercise of playing devil's advocate and angel's advocate, he shot up his hand and said, "Benita, we do science here. Devil's advocate is science." And I accepted that, and I asked him, would he be willing to do the exercise? And he did the exercise of playing devil's advocate and angel's advocate with one of the senior women there. And when I debriefed him, he said, we had so much fun with all the new ideas bubbling up, playing angel's advocate. We didn't even play devil's advocate. And I suggested to them that maybe they have half-baked idea sessions, because I had been told that people had the experience of having to stand up in front of a firing squad if they had a new idea. So they implemented having half-baked idea sessions. And one of the senior women had told me that she had had an idea. This was actually all the way back when Obama was coming into office, and we didn't know if we were going to be able to continue space travel. And so one of the senior women had told me that she had the idea that if we can't do space travel, we should do homeland security, global warming, and renewable energy. All fire prevention. In any case, I'm collecting the articles of NASA's work with renewable energy and global warming, which they are doing along with the space travel.
Awesome. I think I really like this kind of theme around communication and communication styles, and it's really kind of a theme that's coming through. One of the things that we often hear is that when women founders and men founders go to approach VCs or other investors, that they actually get asked completely different kinds of questions. And it's kind of along the lines of what you're talking about here. I'd be interested to hear from you, Maya. Have you experienced that at all directly, or what can you tell us about that? The kinds of questions that get asked.
Yeah, great question. There is research by Dana Kanze showing that women get asked how they're not going to lose everything that they managed to build so far, and men get asked how they're going to rule the world, how they're going to succeed big. My own personal experiences align with the research remarkably well, much more well than I'd like it to be. So in business, obviously, you have the point until your company really starts to grow, sort of the early stages, where people need to believe in you, to give you some money so that you can try to make something happen. Most companies need some capital in order to prove anything. And then there's a point afterwards when there's already numbers and you can make decisions more objectively, right? Women struggle the most in these early days when you need to believe in someone's potential. And I have just the most incredible stories from that time. And then afterwards, once my company started doing really well objectively, it was just night and day. We raised money in 1 week. But still, women still have a harder time afterwards, just not to the same level. So, I can share one specific story. I had to think which one to
share your story, Maya.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think which one. Okay, so this one was on tape in front of 200 people. So this is not something that investors do secretly. There was a competition. I'm not going to say which one, just to try to protect their privacy a little bit. There was a competition, and the finalists were selected by the audience. So I was one of the 3 finalists. And then from these finalists, the winner was getting picked through a panel of investors. And they had this big discussion in front of everybody to decide who is going to win first, second, third. So they're having this conversation, and there is a male investor leading the discussion. There is a female investor on this investor panel, and 2 more male investors on the panel. And so the lead investor is talking about me. He's like, well, what business does she have running a musical AI company? She's a musician. So from my whole resume, the only thing he remembered is that I learned how to sing in parallel to my computer science PhD. Doesn't remember that I'm a computer science professor. Okay. So the female investor reminds him. She says she's a computer science professor in AI. It's a musical AI company. And he just can't hear her. It's the most surreal experience. And it's one that I had so many times. Investors are incapable of remembering my qualifications. So this goes back and forth a few times. He just sort of keeps brushing off that I'm a professor. Okay. And then like 2 minutes later, they talk about the guy that ended up winning, who has expertise. It was something that was completely irrelevant to computing or gaming. His company was something to do with games and AI. I think he had either physics or there was some kind of expertise that had just nothing to do with his company. And they said very confidently, and everybody agreed, he will figure it out. And he got first place. Yeah, so that's just one of very many stories.
Yeah, he will figure it out. Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I can say that in my own life, I've had several experiences related to communication style. I can tell it has to do with something that you brought up about asking questions. I'll never forget when I went to join the International Finance Corporation in Asia, and it was a new position. There wasn't anything, it had never existed before. And so we had a big retreat with all the leadership. And I thought, this is an amazing opportunity to ask my peers and colleagues what they think this new position that had not existed before should do to serve them. And I thought I had all these great conversations, and I went to talk to my boss the next week, and I said, wow, so how did it go? What was the feedback? Well, people really like you, but they just wonder if you know what your job is supposed to be. Like, that was the takeaway, because I was asking them, for their feedback about what I should be doing. So that really, really resonates with me. Well, and Laura, what other sort of examples do you have of this kind of communication dichotomy in terms of, especially if you can try to apply it as much to the business and investment world?
Sure. Well, I mean, research has shown all kinds of things that are unfortunate, and one of them is that women are increasingly encouraged to negotiate their hiring package, their salary, all these kinds of things, and they are doing so in better numbers. But those who do so are found to be less likable than women who accept what they are first offered. And it's sort of been this ongoing problem that we need women to do things that are classically considered to be more masculine, right? And yet when they do them, they are punished. So I do have a good study that I used with one of my classes to try to talk about this very issue that was about entrepreneurs, and they used a real-world competition. So they do not give the name, but one can sort of read between the lines about how that worked out. And what they did was they purposely trained some of the presenters to do a particular thing. And it was all women-led businesses. And what they did was have them stress not their own qualifications, but the social benefit. There's some proof that there's a mitigating factor that if you're advocating not just for yourself, like I have this great company and I need money, which would go well really with a masculine presenter whose biology matched that. But instead, they found that women who advocated for the good of a community or the good of humanity or stopping global warming or a bigger problem. So I know I sound kind of fierce, but it's in service of this really good thing. Not me, but stopping global warming or having children be able to get music access or some other kind of higher purpose thing worked a lot better. So there are strategies, right? And there is proof that we can coach people into doing things. It doesn't solve the original problem, which is that we like male bodies saying powerful things and we get pretty uncomfortable because it still doesn't feel right? It feels off. And so what I always tell my students, in addition to things when we find out, like arguing on the behalf of a social benefit. So they say, for example, if you're advocating for more salary, I need to be able to support my family, right? Or I need to be able to be successful in this area. And so this is what I need to move here. Those kinds of, I want to be able to give it all to this company. I don't want to be doing any kind of side hustle or having to do other consulting, right? Sort of making it sound like you're trying to help others, and that works. Anyway, so we also work a lot on how we can help be aware that that is just what's happening, that this is an implicit bias problem, can help people break a bad cycle of getting more upset or more emotional, which, as you all know, will lead to even further being dismissed as women.
Right. So, so what is the answer here? Bonita, I'm not sure that you're going to necessarily be able to come up with the whole answer right this minute, but do we need more women investors? Do we need, what is the path forward?
Well, certainly we need more women investors. And what I want to emphasize, this is my specialty, because it's not the whole answer, but to be talking about these differences in terms, not just in terms of different communication styles, but different competencies. These are different competencies. Just like I was talking earlier about continuous process improvement as being so important in one particular organization, but all organizations. When I did my original research, the new thing was continuous process improvement. And the woman who had created the process at Sun Microsystems was applying to be promoted to director, but she wasn't being promoted. I talked to the VP in charge of her area, and I said, why is she not being promoted? Oh, she doesn't get along with people. She's always complaining. And I said, now, didn't she create your whole continuous process improvement system, which she had told me was the way she thinks? And he said, yes. And I said, well, could her complaining be doing continuous process improvement? And he said, I never thought of it that way. And likewise, I had interviewed another executive specifically, what is your perception about why women were not being promoted? And he said, they're not ready yet. And I said, what does ready look like to you? And he said, they'd be competent. And I said, what does competency look like to you? He said, they'd be able to get right to the heart of the matter. Women keep bringing in all this peripheral stuff. And he had actually Peter Senge's book on his desk at the time. Peter Senge, when he wrote The Fifth Discipline, which was about how we need more systems way of thinking. And I had several executives with that book on his desk. And that's the book that I had been reading when I finally closed it and said, someone has got to start talking about this is the way women think. So that's my pitch here is frame this with competencies. These are competencies, and I call them relational competencies. I put a handout on the tables for a list of the competencies that I have articulated. For me, this is what will have us even redesign the workplace. We're in a time where we're redesigning the workplace anyway, but to be able to redesign the workplace so we have these competencies. And I will also say that the men are very effective once that's formulated as competencies. They're very effective working with competencies. They don't know how to work with a different style or different values or feminine energy. But when you put it in terms of competencies, oh, I can work with this. This is valuable. And the synergy of the two, because I don't want to be putting men down or the individualistic traditional ways of doing things down. It's how we want to work them together.
Also, just really quickly, women have as bad implicit bias against women as men do. This is not something men are doing to women. It's something people do to women.
I appreciate you saying that. I wanted to kind of elaborate on this point as well. So a very common solution that I see in the VC space is they're saying we're going to hire enough female investors, and then the female investors are going to solve the female entrepreneur problem. It's completely misguided. It is problematic on so many levels. First of all, it's saying, let's not really do very much right now about female entrepreneurs, right? Because female investors are a minority, and it's going to take a while to fix this issue. And secondly, yeah, it's assuming, just like Laura said, that somehow women are what? We're growing up on a different planet. We are not subject to the same biases. I think sometimes women perhaps, I'm not even sure, put in more effort to work on their own implicit bias. I know I had to. But ultimately, yeah, we need everybody to help. There's also this issue with female investors bringing in companies led by women, and then the senior partners turning them down. So we need a solution that goes all across.
It seems to me it's part about confronting this bias in the system, because it clearly has to be about bias, since we all know that the enterprises with women in leadership positions actually outperform from a pure kind of performance perspective. But also, I'm intrigued by these competencies, and how do we get to a place where these are competencies that are equally valued to the other, range of competencies in the business world? I think that's a really important kind of question that we have to ask ourselves. How do we value them at least equally? I'd like to ask if there are any. I'm sure you have questions for these three experts here in the room. I'd love to entertain. Yes, can you come? Well, I'll go to you. It's just because we have the live stream, so just there you go.
This is exactly the question you were just about to. So how did they present the competencies to the men that made it more palatable? Like, that's what I was curious about.
Right. So how did they present the competencies in a way that was absorbable and palatable by the leadership, the men?
Well, actually, starting with stories, like my Carol Bard story, which I've had a lot of men say, I really like that story. And also using Deborah Tannen's work on different communication styles. Her video shows children playing and how it shows up in children at a very, very early age. I like to think of it as this work is disarming, taking the arming out of the gender conversation, and have an opportunity for people to actually identify for themselves their own experience. Even for men and women to be able to identify, I actually also bring in some incidents from personal relationships and how we have these biases in personal relationship, like women thinking that their husbands are not listening to them because they're not looking into their eyes, because that's very typical. The high context people, they look into people's eyes. The low context people, that's too much information. We have to look elsewhere. And to be able to laugh about it and recognize it is really it has been the beginning, at least has been my approach. But then I'm an advocate of my students and people in workshops to be able to use the language to identify competencies, to spread it through your organization, and recognize people for these competencies. Now, of course, it'd be great to do top-down training and everyone knows about it, but that's, to me, that's wishful thinking at this point. And I've had several companies, in my history, it's been resistant. I had one company said, "Oh, showing Deborah Tannen's video, that would open up a can of worms." So again, I wish I had something more absolute about it. But for me, it's like any cultural phenomenon. It starts with the people involved and spreading it, sharing it, and teaching it.
It seems like it's also really related to diversity conversation. Diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation that is really prominent across a huge range of organizations, and valuing what each of us brings, our lived experiences, our diversity. Maybe that's the way into the conversation, is through that lens. Laura, did you have something?
I was just going to add that, so there's a lot of research on that too. Harvard Business Review had a great report on it, I think 3 years ago, where they found that diversity training often backfires when it becomes a sort of a mandatory training that you have to go to. And what they have found is it should be incentive-based. I actually agree with Bonita wholeheartedly that we should call these relational competencies, because if it even smacks of femininity, it will be devalued, right? So I don't like that, but I think it's absolutely true. It's not going to help some of the perception problems, but I think it's a good idea and will certainly help with more powerful people. But anyway, what they found was much more successful is positive incentives. So they, for example, started posting at some companies how many managers, each manager who had what sort of their score was in increasing the diversity of their part of the organization. So nobody got yelled at, nobody got scolded, but it was made publicly available what that information was. And lo and behold, the teams started getting more diverse once the information was not allowed to be secret. Once you got a bonus for having achieved something instead of getting punished or scolded. Nobody likes to be scolded. One of the key things as a communication scholar I have to run around saying all the time is fear appeals don't work, right? Don't try to scare. I teach a gender health and sexuality class where they're like, just scare them out of this behavior. Like, that will never work. Tons of research shows. And nobody likes to be scolded, right? And certainly very competent business people don't want to be. So the more we can make it a value added, the bonus, right? Not the bias. In the same way that mixed gender teams do better, so do mixed race teams. They make better quality decisions, is what we call it in communication. Very much the same idea.
I'm going to dovetail from that, though, and say that I think a lot of people are saying that just dropping women and diverse people in and stirring is not the whole solution. And that's why I'm such an advocate for identifying these competencies. And, for instance, there's research that was done at Stanford that's much more substantive in terms of research to what I've done, but identifying that the independent lens and the interdependent lens. And the interdependent lens, the differences can come with regards to East-West cultures, global North and global South, your work environment, gender is high on their list, race, and several other factors. So class and education. So that there are a number of different influences for having a more interdependent lens or an independent lens, and how we can work them together and self-identify. And I'm an advocate for more relational people to be able to say, hey, when you sitting down in a new group, to be able to say, hey, you can count on me for being a fire preventer. This is the way I look. I have a broad way of looking at all the ramifications of an issue. So don't think I'm just scattered all over the place. This is about strategic thinking in a whole different way.
Yes, sure. Hold on a second. Let me go to you. See.
So I wanted to move us a little bit more tactical from the systemic that you guys have been talking about, since we're talking about funding events, and the funding process, especially when it involves venture capital, is usually quite patronizing and belittling to the entrepreneur. And so my question is, just the very nature of, you come in, you've thought about your business for 2 years, you've got your stuff together, and within 10 minutes somebody's going to come up and decide whether you're right or wrong about your idea. That whole concept is just, bizarre. But anyway, so the question is, are there tactics that can move the conversation in that moment away from that kind of, please can you help me moment, to something where it's more of a discourse between equals?
That's great. So it's like getting to the kind of the power dynamic there. Yeah. Maya, do you have something to
That is
say
such
about
a
that?
good question. It's something that I've sort of peripherally thought about, but never completely focused on. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, the whole process is really not designed with female competencies, relational competencies incorporated into there. I've learned over time to just ignore advice from people who know about my business for 10 minutes, because it's never good advice. It is literally never good advice, regardless of how confidently it is delivered. So the process in reality, before they actually write a check, is more involved. The fastest I've ever had anybody give money to my company was 20 minutes, but that's not normal. Usually they go and do the diligence in the background. And so there is an opportunity to bring in experts and to seriously consider the quality of the company, right, and what its promise is. But then you have Theranos, for example, right, where they invested in leadership that had no domain expertise, without clearly bringing domain experts to assess the quality of the company, which to me, I don't know if it's my relational competencies or just common sense, it is absurd, okay? It is absolutely absurd. So this due diligence process, which already exists, needs to be a real due diligence process, which brings in domain experts and needs to actually be methodical. Because right now, investors pride themselves for using their gut feeling, for using their instinct, which has been shown many, many times to be equivalent to bias. Instinct and bias are the same thing. So we need a complete revamp on what this due diligence means, and investors need to go through a process to justify their decisions in a consistent way. And that way we can remove gender and race from the equation, and sexuality, anything else that has no place in this decision making. And not only is it going to be more fair, it's going to lead to better decision making, right? So I think due diligence is a place to do it, and perhaps investors can also learn over time to withhold assuming that they know your company better than you do after 5 minutes of hearing about your company. But that's only one piece of it, right? Ultimately, if their decisions are founded on logic and normal process, that would already be huge progress.
Do either of you have anything you want to add to that?
First of all, I'd like to say that the last time we had a conversation, we all discovered that none of us like to watch Shark Tank. So imagine how their audience would expand if it wasn't such an attack mode, and the exposure to more startups. I just think that's interesting. And the other thing that when Maya just said something about, I don't know if it's my common sense. I attended a workshop at Stanford about getting more women on boards, and one woman was there who was on the board of 4 companies. And she was asked the same question that I had asked Carol Bartz: what do you bring to the executive teams that wouldn't be there? And her answer was common sense. So what does that say about her, and what does it say about the other men on the team? Not much. That she only has common sense and that they don't have it. I took her aside at the reception afterwards and told her the Carol Bartz story, and she said, "Oh, that's what I mean by common sense. I have more systems way of thinking, the fire prevention." She didn't even have the language to be able to identify. So that's why I'm a campaigner for this.
I'm just going to say that's where I can chime in just for briefly that one of the problems we have is we literally don't have language for powerful women who are likable and competent and interesting and good at what they do. When we don't have the words, as famously has been said among feminists, before we had the word sexual harassment, we just called it life. Right? And we can't do anything about life. We can't do anything about common sense. We need to develop a language about these consistent problems with attack mode ideas that's somehow going to lead to your gut. And guts are full of all kinds of terrible biases and bad decision making. We need to come up with different ways to talk about all kinds of things, but particularly about women and power being together in a healthy, natural, normal, good, productive way. We are really impoverished in that language right now.
It's interesting. Okay. There's another question coming.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on your question a little bit. To put myself in the mind of the investors, they have to be leaving huge amounts of potential gain on the table. And I'm curious, I know you can't prove a false negative, but there's been research on that, and if there's a way to sort of capture the lost gains here.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's a point that we need to make somehow as loud as we can. They're leaving a lot of money on the table. It's been shown specifically in business, and it's been shown across all fields, that women are just as competent. So when you take half your workforce and you don't give them the same opportunities, you're hurting the economy, you're hurting the bottom line. It is obvious, and research has shown it over and over and over and over again. So these biases are hurting the investors. They're one of the main groups of people who are suffering from this, right? So yeah, just absolutely. I think it's such an important point.
Absolutely. A lot being left on the table here.
And I think appealing to what's being left on the table is absolutely the right way to go, as opposed to much more ephemeral ideas, right, about equity. And even though they're things I fight for every day, call it, from bias to bonus. Call it a bonus. You could be making more money.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's where we're interested in taking this conversation. Any other questions for our...
And I'd be interested if anyone has any identification with what we've been saying from their own experience. Do you want to share?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Kevin.
First of all, thank you for being here. So you've been talking a lot about relational competencies and that women are aligned to them generally in a different way than men. And I think we also understand that a lot of deals are done not through cold introductions, but through networks and relationships. So how might women entrepreneurs seek to leverage that skill set as an advantage rather than as a deficit?
I mean, I can talk. That's such a good question. Yeah, so the network effect is a fairly well-known challenge for women. There are several reasons for this, and it's quite nuanced. So one of the problems is that people are more willing to introduce men to investors that they know. So even if you kind of have a similar network, you're less likely to break into it. My experience has been that, which again, it's one person, it doesn't mean very much, is that I could actually break in to meet people with enough persistence. In fact, there was research done that bias for women in particular doesn't manifest at the introduction level when it comes to email. So women get at least as many responses from investors over email. The problem kicks in when they see you or hear you, when they get to experience the feminine, basically. I've had this experience, it's really engraved in my mind because it happened so many times, where an investor who I had a really good conversation with, they know quite a bit about my company, they walk in, they look at me, and I just know it's over. It's a really tough thing to prove, of course, but you can kind of see the disappointment in their face, and that's it. It's done. Of course, all of that changed once I had numbers to show really good growth. Suddenly, they were able to sort of work something out in their minds. But yeah, I find it actually really interesting that a lot of places where emphasis is placed, they are important, like having more female investors and having a network. But it's not actually where the biggest problems are. The biggest problem is that they don't believe in women, which has to do with brilliance bias. Brilliance bias is this bias that, the good thing I have a chance to work it in right now, it's this belief that certain jobs, like being in computer science, mathematician, music composer for some reason, require innate ability, that you need to sort of be born with something special. And when it comes to being a CEO of a company, investors believe that you have to be born with that something special. It's a really, really, really strong instance of the brilliance bias. And they just don't believe that women have that extra something, right? So that's where we need to fix things.
Well, I think this, as I mentioned in the outset, this is sort of what we consider to be the first of a series of conversations that we want to have. And I think in subsequent conversations, we'd like to invite some investors, now that we've sort of posed the set of problems and introduced this concepts around bias and relational competencies and communication styles and all these things. Now what we'd like to do is start to invite some investors and more entrepreneurs to the table. I think we had originally hoped to welcome Marian Rivera here today. She had a scheduling conflict. We'll definitely invite her back from Ulu Ventures. She's doing a lot of really interesting work in this space, focusing on women and people of color, founders that are women and people of color. Very, very interesting work. And many others also, by the way, are actually, intentionally and purposefully targeting the kinds of entrepreneurs that often get left behind. And in fact, at Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, that is one of our foremost goals, is to support global entrepreneurs to build the kind of network and get access to new networks that they wouldn't otherwise have, and be able to grow and scale their companies that are all also working for the greater good. So with that, I would just like to thank our panelists and maybe ask, as you each sign off, maybe just ask each of you for a prediction. If we're sitting here 5 years from now, what is your prediction for what we might be talking about?
Go in reverse order.
Totally on the spot, by the way. That was
I get asked to predict things all the time. Where is musical AI going? What's going to happen to artificial intelligence? I like to take a really active approach about it. Kind of like with the environment. We can't sit there and wait for something to happen. We have to fix what's happening to female entrepreneurs, what's happening to our economy because there aren't enough women being involved. I really think a lot of economic crises wouldn't happen if we had more women in business, more women leading businesses, more female investors. So as a researcher and entrepreneur myself, I do everything I can to try to actually make a difference. And so proud to have these wonderful colleagues here doing the same thing. So I guess instead of predicting if it's okay, I'd like to ask you if you could please do what you can, do your part to try to make a difference. So in 5 years, we'll be in a different place.
Right on.
How about you, Laura? Any predictions?
I would say the same. I focus on awareness and on trying to train my students and the people I do workshops with to have that greater awareness and to self-interrupt, interrupt yourself, and speak for yourself. Correcting others never gets us anywhere, right? Nobody likes to be scolded. But thinking of, wait a minute, I think I judged too quickly there, and trying to model for others what would be much more helpful and inclusive and therefore more profitable communication styles is what my teaching is about, and what about a lot of my research is about as well. So I am cautiously optimistic that we will make incremental progress. I wish I could say I thought we were going to make a ton, but definitely some.
So I will say this is kind of a joke on me, but I actually had a colleague say to me a couple of weeks ago, Benita, imagine what the world would have been like if you had gotten your book out 20 years ago. And because I had written a book proposal and was told by the agent who had been connected with Jackie Onassis, big important agent, she had said, Benita, you wrote your book for men and women. Only women buy books. You have to rewrite your book proposal. So I put it on the shelf. And so I actually have several people here at the table that want to join me in writing this book, and also another author who already has 6 books out on gender intelligence. So if we can get that out in the next 2 years, I think there could be a major difference. But I'd also like to acknowledge that what's going on in the world, that the shift towards climate, the concern for climate change, climate restoration, is calling on all of us to be re-looking at capitalism and our whole system. Of course, it's not just climate restoration, it's our social issues too, and I'm just hoping that we can continue the focus on combining business with social impact, and that would certainly make a big difference. And I'm also including the redesign of the workplace based on what's happening as a result of the pandemic. All those factors.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all 3 of you so very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for sitting here, and those of you on the live stream, also thank you for joining. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.